God, you are so kind to us. God, let us sit in this moment. God, we've been declaring that you've been here even before any chairs went up. God, the prayer team has been inviting you into this place from early this morning. The truth is, God, you've always been here. And so, God, even as we sit in this moment, we pray that you would unsettle us. God, shake us to the core. Till the ground, God, because you desire to plant new seeds. Break it down, God, that we would be able to receive what you have. God, help us to sit in this moment with you. Holy Spirit, we ask that you would now prepare us to hear your word. What do you have to say? God, some of us are perhaps coming in here hungry and with questions. God, we do ask that you would answer those questions, but if you don't, the one thing we cannot leave this place without is your presence. So God, whether you answer our questions or not, let us not leave this place without knowing that we were with you and that we are going with you. So Holy Spirit, now root that, bake that into our DNA to know that you are a God that never leaves and never forsakes us. God, I look to this word not as simple pages in a book, not as words on pages, but as an opportunity to see your face. And God, I pray that we would do the same. Holy Spirit, I pray that you would make me good at only one thing, getting out of the way that people would see your face. Pray this in Jesus' name. Everybody said, amen. That's what's up. Hey, church, I'm real glad to be here with you guys. We're going to jump right in because I tend to be long-winded, and I know that you guys run on a schedule. So let me make sure I get every word I want to say in. Why don't you go ahead and turn to Psalm 130. Psalm 130, if you don't have a Bible, it'll be on the screen. I'm going to read this for us, and we're going to jump right in. Is that cool? Cool. I was going to do it anyways. I was just being courteous. Psalm 130, I'm reading from the CSB version. It says this: out of the depths I called to you, Lord. Lord, listen to my voice. Let your ears be attentive to my cry for help. Lord, if you kept an account of iniquities, Lord, who could stand? But with you there is forgiveness, so that you may be revered. I wait for the Lord. I wait and put my hope in his word. I wait for the Lord more than the watchman for the morning, more than the watchman for the morning. That boy had to say that bar twice. Israel, put your hope in the Lord, for there is faithful love with the Lord. And with him is redemption in abundance, and he will redeem Israel from all its iniquity. Church, today I want to talk about what it looks like to face our guilt. I think for a long time, the church has been the culprit of saying things like faith over feelings, and as a result, we've suspended the fact that we are people with feelings. We've suppressed the fact that we are emotional beings and that our emotions perhaps are trying to tell us something both about ourselves and about God. So I want to talk about guilt in particular and what it means to look deeply into the face of the guilt that we carry. Church, if there's anything I want you to walk away with today, it's this. Jesus shows us that the reward of facing our guilt is freedom. Jesus shows us through this passage that the reward of facing our guilt is freedom. A few things that I think are really important to pull out from this passage that I want to offer us today. The first one is this: God invites us to face our guilt. God invites us to face our guilt. Church, let me give some context to this song because I think it's probably important for us to know the occasion of what's happening here. No one really knows the specific occasion of what's happening, and the more that I studied and the more that I tried to understand, hey, what's the historical context to Psalm 130? Some people said this, some people said that, and at the end of the day, I realized nobody knew what was going on. But one thing we do know about this psalm is that King David wrote it. And while we might not know the occasion of David's writing, we do know that he was the author of this psalm. And let me tell y'all, David has no shortage of moments that would have probably produced guilt in his own life. Church, can I be real for a second? Okay, is it okay? No curse words up here, right? I could be 100% real. Because, we're going to be talking about some things. Listen, consider 2 Samuel chapter 12. David had a daughter. Her name was Tamar. And in 2 Samuel chapter 12, Tamar, David's daughter, was raped by her half-brother Amnon. That's in the text. So you just go at home, you go to 2 Samuel chapter 12, you realize that Tamar was raped by her half-brother Amnon. And check this out. David was practically absent in those moments. In fact, if you go to chapter 12 and you read through the chapter, you realize that there is a description of how David felt and what he did when he realized that his son Amnon raped his half-sister Tamar. The text says that David grew furious. And then the story continued. As I read that, I thought to myself, oh, okay, he was mad. But that was all he was. You ever come up to somebody and you tell them about some kind of injustice or some kind of pain or some kind of hurt that's happened in your life or some kind of injustice or hurt that's happening in the world, and they tell you, man, I can't believe that happened. I'm so angry. But that's all they do? In Spanish, we have a saying, perro que ladra pero no muerde. Dog that barks but doesn't bite. It's this idea that David was actually so furious but not angry enough to do something. That's all the context that we get. But then in the very next chapter, 2 Samuel chapter 13, David goes from ignoring the rapist to becoming the rapist. You just read it in the text. I'm not bugging. I just read the text and I see it. Not surprisingly, right after David ignores the fact that his daughter was raped by her half-brother Amnon, he then becomes the rapist himself. He uses his power and his influence to force his way sexually on another man's wife. Not to mention that he got that man murdered. Or perhaps consider in the very next chapter, notice that this is a succession of chapters. Chapter 12, she gets raped. David doesn't do anything. Chapter 13, David rapes Bathsheba. And then chapter 14, Absalom, the other half-brother who plotted to kill his brother Amnon for raping his sister, now tries to kill David. Now listen, y'all, David knew well and good what was happening in the heart of his son Absalom, that he was growing in vengeance and in hatred and in bitterness inside of him. But David, perhaps in cowardice, didn't confront his son. And ultimately, it led to the death of Absalom. And after hearing the news of of his son's death, David cries this in 2 Samuel 14. He says, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, only if I had died in your place, Absalom, my son. Now, church, let me be honest. There's certainly grief and mourning happening here for David. No doubt about it. David is mourning the death of his son, but perhaps even mourning the tragedy of his daughter's rape. But let me tell you, we would be foolish to think that only mourning is happening here. No, David is feeling his fair share of guilt during these moments. But through this psalm, Psalm 130, David does something that perhaps some of us don't have the courage to do. David faces his guilt. He looks square into the face of his guilt. And church, let me be honest for a moment, because I think it's important to kind of clarify some of the nuance that are happening here in the text. And what I'm saying is, I believe that though here in our culture we don't really know how to deal with our guilt, I believe that that's true. Because some of us are terrified of facing our guilt because we live in a culture that encourages us to be more forgiving of ourselves. That we would give ourselves more passes when we've done something harmful to another person. We should be kinder to ourselves. Now, church, I do think deeply that there are perhaps even some of us in this room that don't treat ourselves kindly enough. I do believe that there are some in this room that aren't patient with ourselves or even gracious with ourselves for that matter. And then I think that there are some of us that treat ourselves and love ourselves very poorly. I do believe that that's true. But church, I've got to be honest that to disregard or deny the guilt that we sometimes experience at the expense of being kind to ourselves is perhaps not the response God desires for us. We should treat ourselves kinder. We should learn how to be, in a sense, more forgiving of ourselves. But what I want to talk about is that self-forgiveness in some ways is an illusion. God wants us to face our guilt because God deeply believes that woven inside of our feelings, guilt included, is a beautiful revelation of who we are and who He is. It may not have been part of God's intention in the very beginning when He created us, but church, guilt is part of the human experience. Guilt is very much part of the human experience. In fact, I would go as far as saying, if I could, guilt, church, I believe, is a gift to us from God. Guilt is a gift to us from God. See, what I love so deeply about Psalm 130 are the words that David uses to describe the condition that he's in. Listen to what he says. Right in the very beginning, what does he say? He says, out of the depth I call to you, Lord. Out of the depth I call to you. Now, something really interesting about the word depth here. The word depth in the Hebrew is the word for abundance. It's the same word that we hear Hannah back in the Old Testament in a previous story where she describes the reason why she was compelled to pray to God. Listen to what she says. She says, I've been praying from the depth of my anguish and resentment. Same word. Now, church, I think it's a really interesting choice of words that David uses here. Because abundance, perhaps, is the last thing that I imagine David is experiencing at this moment. You see, when I hear depth, I often think valley. I often think a hole that I'm stuck in. But here, David is saying the opposite. He's saying, I have an abundance of something, and it's overwhelming to me. And verse 3, church, confirms to us what he's abundant in. Listen to what it says. Lord, if you kept an account of iniquities, who could stand, Lord? You see, what David is trying to help us see is not that he has a lack of things around him, but that he has an overabundance of something, and that something is guilt. You see, David isn't in a hole, empty. David doesn't find himself in a valley by himself. No, David is in a hole filled with overwhelming guilt. There is an overabundance of guilt. And you know, church, the more I read this passage and as I looked at it more deeply and honestly, I had to ask myself the question, what is it about guilt that makes it so difficult for us to face? Why is guilt, the weight of it, why is it so difficult to look at it, to face it? Now, church, this might sound elementary, but for me, it was somewhat of a revelation as I looked at this passage more deeply. But you see, guilt is the feeling that we experience when we do something wrong. And you probably look at me like, duh, Rich. I'm like, well, you know, it was a revelation to me, you know. Guilt is the feeling that we experience when we do something wrong. Now, church, could I get real with us for a second? You know, I'll never forget the face on my wife when in our second year of marriage, I confessed to her that I was indulging in pornography. I sat in our little office in our little 3-bedroom apartment in Rochester, New York, where we were living at the time. I sat her down and through tears and with my body shaking, I looked at my wife as much as I could, as much as my shame allowed me to, and I confessed that I was indulging in pornography. Now, let me tell you something about my wife. My wife is very gentle, very thoughtful woman of God. And she looked at me as through my tears I made this confession to her, and she forgave me. And she extended grace, and her tone was gentle. But church, that face was the face of a person that was deeply hurt. I heard her words. I was thankful for her posture, but her face told me that she was deeply, deeply hurt. I had to deal with that. I had to deal with the pain of knowing that I had caused somebody that I deeply love hurt. And immediately I felt guilty for what I had said and what I had done. But here's the thing, church, that wasn't even the scariest part. It wasn't that I had to muster up the courage to confess to my wife that I had just broken vows that I had committed to upholding. What was terrifying me was the reality that I was a person that could actually hurt someone. That through this confession and through this guilt, through this weight that I carried, God was telling me something about myself, and I wasn't ready to hear it. God was saying, Rich, you are capable of harming people. Rich, if you thought yourself to be at a distance from hurting people, let this guilt, let this weight on you, let this moment of confession remind you, you are capable of hurting someone. In church, I had to deal with that. I was unsettled by how I hurt. I was unsettled how my own loneliness, I was unsettled by how my own hurt had driven me to hurt someone that I deeply cared for. Now, church, part of the beauty of this passage here is that David is not just speaking for himself. You see, perhaps unknowingly, David is showing us the condition of our own hearts. That we are people who carry this burden of guilt and often don't know what to do with it, where to take it. He's showing us the ways that we harm our relationship with others and our relationship with God. And so David, of course, out of that depth, out of that overwhelming abundance of guilt, he cries out to the Lord. You see, church, he's not just simply crying out, but he's crying out to the Lord. He's directing his crying to God. David is crying out from the depth, but he's not just acknowledging his guilt. He's engaging with his guilt to allow it to lead him to the place where his heart is desperately hungry for. Church, here's what I've said in the past. I said, man, if we continue as a church at large to be the proponent that says to ignore your feelings or suppress your feelings, then I'm afraid that we might not get to God at all. You see, part of what our feelings do, whether it be anger, shame, guilt, fear, sadness, is that it's trying to tell you something about your needs. Our feelings are actually trying to show us that our hearts are hungry for something. So the question is for us, what is guilt meant to tell us about ourselves and our design? You see, church, if we ignore our guilt, then we will overlook the reality that our hearts are hungry for forgiveness and wholeness. You see, church, we were wired for intimacy. We were wired to be in close relationship, not simply with one another, but with the God who sees over us. And when we choose to ignore our guilt, we choose to ignore our design. Church, if we miss our guilt and where it's meant to take us, then I'm afraid we might never really get to God. You see, guilt is a gift because it shows us our hearts and it empowers us to give it what it craves for. When we finally muster the courage to face our guilt, as David is doing here in Psalm 30, we finally realize what our hearts are hungry for, and we empower it so that it would feed on precisely what it's hungry for. But church, there's no way to talk about facing our guilt and no way to talk about the obstacles of that without considering this second thought. You see, God is not just a God from this passage that offers us, invites us to face our guilt, but God is also giving us the courage to receive love. God is giving us the courage to receive love. And I want you to take real close attention to the fact that I said receive love and not give love. And we'll talk about this in a moment, but I think part of what we often should be doing within the church is not so much teaching people how to love, but teaching people how to receive it. I think if we learn how to receive love, it'll empower us naturally to give it. David shows really incredible humility in this passage. David shows incredible humility and trust when he said this: Lord, if you kept an account of iniquities, iniquities being just another word for our own sin and darkness, if you kept an account, if you pulled out the pen and the pad and you kept an account of all my iniquities, who could stand? Who could even stand in your presence? Who could even be close to you? Who could engage you in intimacy if everything that ever was wedged between you and us, between love, between our relationship, who could stand in your presence? You see, David was very aware that if the thing that was wedged between us and God was not removed and God kept an account of it, none of us could stand in his presence. But I've said this before to our church, the Bible wasn't written in English, Spanish, Spanglish. It was written in Hebrew, and Greek, and Aramaic, languages that are real dense and heavy, and oftentimes it takes several of our own words to capture just one word in this passage. They beefy words. And the idea of iniquity is one of those words. It's one of those beefy words. You see, there's a picture behind the word iniquity that you don't get in the English that exists in its original language. Avon is the Hebrew word. Avon is the Hebrew word for iniquity, and it's like a boulder sitting on your back. Like a big old boulder sitting on your back, weighing you down, keeping you from moving forward. You see, this is what iniquity is. Keeping us from being in relationship with God. You see, it sits on your back and it keeps you from moving forward, kind of the way guilt sits on us when we have harmed someone, and instead of acknowledging and confessing it, we explain it away. This is perhaps the reason why in Psalm 32, verses 3 and 4, David, the same author, says this. He says, when I kept silent, my bones became brittle from my groaning all day long. For you see, day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was drained as in the summer's heat. You see, church, here's what we do oftentimes. We'll look at something that we've done that was hurtful to someone else, and we'll say, Pastor Rich, but you don't understand, man. They hurt me real bad, and what should I do? I can't just hold on to this. Like, this is just something that deeply penetrated me. Pastor Rich, you don't know what I've been through. Like, probably, I may not. And what we often do is that we say, man, we need some time. I need some time to think about this, man. They hurt me real bad. I don't know if I could just forgive. I don't know if I could just forgive and let this go. And what happens is we give our space the time, we say, to find wisdom. Say, yo, give me some time, man. I got to find wisdom in all this. But what we're really doing is that we're not giving ourselves the time to find wisdom. We're giving ourselves the time to find the reason not to do what God has asked us to do. Say, Pastor Rich, hold on, man. I got to be wise about this, Rich. Rich, I got to be wise about this. I'm like, bet, listen, I get it. Just make sure that your pursuit is for wisdom and not disobedience. Just make sure that your pursuit is to reconcile and not more isolation. You see, what distance can often do to us when it's clear what we should do is that it leads us to live a life of isolation rather than integration. Church, we give ourselves the space not to find wisdom, but to find reasons, excuses to not do what God has asked us to do. You see, we convince ourselves, well, Pastor Rich, if they didn't blank, then I wouldn't have blank. Or simply we just refuse to acknowledge the guilt of our actions. You see, it's as if David is saying here, God, if you leave this boulder on my back, this is why I love what David is saying here. God, if you leave this boulder on my back, it will crush me. No one will be able to stand in your presence if they could stand at all. You see, if there's anything really clear about what David is doing here, is that David is head deep in his despair and he can't do anything to get himself out of it. David is head deep in his despair and he cannot help himself. There's no getting out of this one on his own. And that's a really big deal for a king. Don't forget, this man is a king. Listen, this man is a king. He's got power. He's got influence. There's nothing that a king could not do in those times. So for him to come to the awareness that he's head deep in his guilt and he cannot help himself out of this, you can't pull the king card on this. In fact, David is realizing that he's come face to face with a different kind of king. One that won't simply allow him to use his power and his influence, as he had just done over this woman, to get himself out of guilt. This is why Ecclesiastes 8:4 says the king's word is supreme. Who can say, what are you doing? I could almost imagine, man, y'all got to throw something at me if I'm going way over time. But listen, I could almost imagine David pulling up to the palace and saying, yo, man, shorty over there, she's looking real fly. I just seen her over the window. Like I was just chilling, having my chai latte. And I seen homegirl from across the way. Let me call my guards here. Yo, that girl over there, I need her. And I could almost imagine, check this out. I could almost imagine the soldiers like, she's married? And David is like, that's the one though. Like, I don't know what you like. Who? I mean, have y'all read? He probably looked at the soldiers like, have y'all read Ecclesiastes? Like, the king's word is supreme. Who can say, what are you doing? Like, y'all must be tripping. Go get that girl. Stop playing games, right? I could almost imagine the tension that they were feeling. But here is David now with all that power and all that bravado, crying out from the depth of his despair, saying, yo, I can't just get myself out of this. See, because people in power, they be feeling themselves a whole bunch. What? I said that? Nah. People in power and people in influence, they be feeling themselves a whole lot. And they forget there's a king of kings. They forget there's a Lord of lords. They forget there's a president of presidents. You see, David is in the depths of his despair. The weight of his darkness is so heavy and so deep that David needs a power outside of himself to rescue him, a presence other than himself to comfort him. Family, this is why, in trust, David cries out from the depths unto the Lord. That's why in humility he acknowledges that God is the only one who could remove the burden of his guilt. This is why in verse 4 he says, but with you, don't miss this, with you there is forgiveness so that you may be revered. God, I know I got myself into something I can't get myself out of. I know that you coming, and if you were to hold every iniquity against us, who can stand? But I know that although you come with power, you come with forgiveness. God, I know that you come with wrath. You come with redemption. God, I know that that's how you come, so let me remind ourselves. In other words, David is saying, God, you are the only one who can hold our guilt against us, but you don't. You are the only one that can keep an account and it be righteous, but you don't. You bring forgiveness instead. Church, this reminds me. Ooh, man, okay, I gotta keep looking at this clock. This reminds me. John chapter 8. Y'all know the story? The adulterous woman is caught, and she's brought out to the middle of the town, and you got the whole squad of Pharisees just looking at her with the all judgy eyes, and they ready to stone her. Now, mind you, side note, she wasn't having an affair by herself. I'm wondering why the dude wasn't out there, but that's just me. But look, she's out here in the middle, and she's got this whole squad around her, ready to stone her, and Jesus is just like in the cut, like, okay, let me see what's happening here from this side. All right, I see it. I see what's happening. And then and then they come up to Jesus and they're like, yo, before we stone this girl, before we rock her to death, I got a question for you. Teacher, I got a question for you. This is going to be good, a good teaching moment for everybody. Let's do this. And they come to Jesus and they said, yo, this woman, she was caught in adultery. You don't want to see it, but, it just happened. And we got to do the do. We got to do what we got to do. The law of Moses tells us to stone her. Also says to stone the dude, but I don't know where he's at. But, let's stone her. Jesus, man, you hate to see it. We just got to do it, though. What would you do? Yo, let me tell you, Jesus is like triple OG, mixtape on mixtape. He's just like standing in the back, and he's like, almost literally, I could imagine him like, I was born for this, fam. And he just like walks up. And he just walks up and he says, give me a second real quick. It's just like writing something out here. It's cool. I got it. He without sin cast the first stone. He without sin cast the first stone. And here's the craziest part. The text says that from the oldest to the youngest, they put down their instruments of judgment, because that's what those rocks were. Y'all know that, right? They put down their instruments of judgment. Here's another free one for y'all. It's crazy to me that it says that the kids also were ready to do the do. Self-righteousness is contagious, y'all. Self-righteousness is contagious, y'all, but that's just free. Look, he puts it down. And they put it down, and one by one, they start walking away. And let me tell you, the rest of this story took me out. Let me read it to you. I still got time, right? Y'all not going to throw stones at me. Okay, cool. Check this out. After everyone left, only he, Jesus, was left. That in itself could preach a sermon. Only he was left with the woman at the center. When Jesus stood up, he said to her, woman, where they at though? Where are they? Woman, hold on. There was a squad out here before, ready to take you out. Where they at? That's just my version. Here's what he actually said. He says, woman, where are they? Check this out. Here's the key. Don't miss this. Has no one condemned you? Has no one condemned you? And she said, no one, Lord. Here's the knockout punch. Neither do I condemn you. Oh man, Jesus is so beautiful. Go, and from now on, sin no more. Church, listen, the beauty of facing our guilt is that we discover that God is the only one that can accuse us, but instead he clears us. The beauty of facing your guilt is that God is the only one who can throw stones at us, but instead he allows himself to be stoned on our behalf. God is the only one that can hang our guilt over us, but instead he hangs on a cross for our sins. Instead of allowing death to swallow us up, he allows death to become his reality. Church, the Lord comes with forgiveness. You see, church, in our humility, in the confession of our sinful behavior, our disposition to bring harm to others, God loves us by coming with forgiveness, and as verse 7 reminds us, with redemption. You see, God's not just ready to forgive you, he's ready to redeem you. God's not just ready to forgive you and give you a clean slate. No, he's ready to redeem you and bring you back to where you once were. He's not just ready to heal your past, but he's ready to empower your present and shape your future. Here's the thing, saints. It takes a lot of courage and faith to receive that kind of love, which is why precisely I said God gives us the courage to receive that love. Let me tell you why. Because if we're going to sit here and raise our hands and say, God, I receive your love, then we are having to receive love this way. And that means that to receive God's love this way is to acknowledge that we need it in the first place. See, to say that we are ready to receive God's love is to say, God, I have some guilt. I have a boulder on my back that I need you to take it. But you see, we have such challenges embracing our limits. We have challenges embracing the fact that you can't do this by yourself. Because maybe you got really good at doing things by yourself. Maybe you got real good at doing things by yourself. Maybe you got good at just kind of covering your spirituality and your journey with Jesus with things you did. You see, we're religious about being religious. And what God is saying here is, no, that guilt, that boulder on your back, you can't take that yourself. Let me be the one to carry it. Oh, you got to admit your limits. You got to admit your limits in order to do that. You see, there are two things working against us. The first one is this, and with these few thoughts, I'll close. You see, two things that are working against us being loved by God in this way. The first one is pride, and the second one is toxic shame. First one is pride, and the next one is toxic shame. You see, in our pride, we rationalize our sin. We give ourselves the space to find wisdom, as we would say. We justify ourselves, or in the language of our culture, we forgive ourselves. Never believing that we should pursue forgiveness from God and those that we've harmed. You say, no, I took care of that with the Lord. Yeah, but what'd you do with the person that you hurt? Man, I didn't mean to do that. I know you probably didn't, but it don't change the impact your decision had. See, there's a huge difference between intention and impact. You may not have meant to do that, but you sure as heck had an impact when you did it. You see, in our pride, we say, I took care of this with God. Don't worry about it. I forgave myself. But church, self-forgiveness, as I said earlier, can be an illusion because you then begin to excuse your intentions and think that it's forgiveness. You see, pride says, I don't need forgiveness because pride says my heart is just fine. Pride works really hard to maintain the right to need no one. But then others of us, we deal with toxic shame. It's when we believe that what we've done is unforgivable. I can't be forgiven. I can't be brought close. I can't be intimate again. You see, we're too broken, too incompetent. We are beyond intimacy. Toxic shame makes us believe that we don't deserve forgiveness or relationship. Toxic shame works really hard. You see, if pride works really hard to maintain the right that it needs no one, then toxic shame works really hard to earn the right to be intimate with anyone. See, guilt is a gift because guilt is relational. It's a matter of intimacy between persons. This is why David says in verse 5, I wait for the Lord. That might have gone right over your head, but here it is. I wait for the Lord. You see, even when he talks about forgiveness and redemption, things that he obviously needs, he knows that what he needs fundamentally is not something, but someone. Because when he gets someone, he will get those things that he needs from God. This is why he says, I'm not waiting on forgiveness. I'm not waiting on redemption. No, I'm waiting on the Lord. I'm waiting for a person, because when that person comes, he will come with forgiveness. He will come with redemption. Church, I pray we would not miss this. Both of these, toxic shame and pride, fall short. And Ephesians 1 reminds us why we need Jesus. In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses according to the riches of his grace. Church, the degree of forgiveness and freedom we experience is directly related to our willingness to be truthful, vulnerable, and surrendered. Let me make this plain. You want to know freedom? You want to know the freedom of God in Jesus? How much of it do you want to know? Because when you determine how much of it, freedom, you want to know, then you'll know how much truthfulness, vulnerability, and surrender you'll have to give. I'm really going to end on this one. I make false promises. I'm so sorry. Here it is, Matthew 11. Matthew 11. I'm out the way. This is from the Message version because I think Eugene Peterson captured it so beautifully. This is the invitation God offers us today. Are you tired? Worn out? Burned out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me, and I love this phrase, and you'll recover your life. See, all of us are on a path of recovery. You'll recover your life. And you know, sometimes that journey's messy, really ugly sometimes, honestly. It looks messed up. We're high one day, we're low the other one. Our faith is strong, can move a mountain. The other days feel like it can't even get out of bed. That's the journey. Can I keep it real? It's the journey. It's a journey. He says, you'll recover your life. Come with me. You don't need to feel hypocritical when your faith is weak, is what I'm trying to say. God invites you to walk with him. I'll show you how to take a real rest, not just put your body on a mattress. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn, check this out, learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy. I won't put the Avon on your back or ill-fitting on you. No, keep company with me and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. Church, today I pray that we would realize, as scary as our guilt and that thing that we work so hard to hide, ironically, is the very thing that will draw you close to God. We work real hard to hide our ugliness. We work real hard to hide the things that we believe will keep us from the presence of God, will shame us out of the presence of God. But I wonder if this is the reason why the author of Hebrews, who I believe is Luke, said, come boldly into the throne of mercy. It's not a throne of truth. I mean, I know God is truth, but why did the author say mercy? Oh, because he knew what we were going to come with was going to require a lot of mercy. I hope that we would realize that the guilt that we work so hard to hide is ironically the thing that will draw us close, and that you would realize, church, that Jesus' invitation is that you would look square in the face of guilt and know that freedom is on the other side of it. Let's pray together. Jesus, we're so grateful. Thank you for your kindness toward us. Thank you for your mercy. Thank you for giving us the grace. God, don't allow us to be the people in this generation. More than ever, God, don't allow us to be the people in this generation that works really hard to run from our guilt, soothe our guilt, sanitize our guilt, but instead, God, give us the courage to look square in the face of guilt, because we know that there is a God who is compassionate, loving, and merciful. And he, because of his son Jesus, overcoming death and darkness, will not allow us to stay in the enslavement or oppression of guilt, but we have freedom because of Jesus. God, give us courage to look at our guilt, knowing that on the other side of it is our Savior. Knowing that as we walk through it is our Savior. Holy Spirit, move, shake us, unsettle us in the ways that you think it's appropriate. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.